So, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coach, the Professional Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Teresa Brooks, founder of Coach Magazine and Podcast and Coach Connect Networking. I am a transformational coach and NLP trainer, and I love to hold these explorations with such fantastic coaches and bring the wisdom to you so that you can start changing and transforming your own life as well as the lives of your clients. And today I'm really excited to have someone that I've been connected with for a very long time. We've been trying to get the podcast for such a while, and we've finally made it. So thanks for joining us, and I'd love to welcome Sarah Ilaria Northe. Now, Sarah previously founded the True North Coaching Academy, and she's the creator of Clearer Coaching and the Inner Child Transformation process. And that's what we're going to be diving into today. She's also creator of Body Wisdom Coaching and Equine Facilitated Coaching. So Sarah's a deeply intuitive coach and inner child practitioner. She's a very experienced coach, trainer and supervisor, NLP Master trainer, mBit coach, and an energy worker, meditation guide and author. So that's quite the list there. And Sarah's worked with hundreds of coaches to work intuitively with the unconscious mind, and help thousands of clients to gain greater awareness of themselves and freedom from their imprinted patterns and limitations. And so these are the juicy things that we're going to be discussing today. So welcome, Sarah. It's lovely to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Absolute pleasure.
Great. So we're gonna dive in really. There's before we started recording, we were talking about the state of the world, and we were talking about people and how they feel, and we're talking about crisis really, and the crisis that we've been through since the pandemic, and really how this has kind of all hit us now. And there's lots of sort of ripples, lots of things that came up over that time, and of course people as ever are searching for purpose and answers, their problems and peace. And so that's the business of coaching, isn't it, really, to help people travel along that road. And each coach that I speak to, they all have their tools and their preferred ways of working. And of course, with yourself, it's all about inner child transformation, isn't it? So we're going to just take a little exploration around what that actually means, if that's okay, Sarah, because it's something we hear a lot, and we may all have different perceptions of what that means, whether it's a real thing, where it lives, how does our inner child show up. So I'd just love you to tell us a little bit about what that actually means, first of all, inner child.
Okay. Well, listening to you, even just reading back the bio there, what struck me was very much the intuition and the unconscious processes that obviously are on offer through this kind of work. And then as you began to talk about the crisis in terms of what we've been through as a world, really, in the last few years, and the adversity that we faced and continue to face, of course, it's our unconscious that tends to kick in, particularly in these times of difficulty and challenge, because particularly as children and in those formative years, we've learnt strategies, coping strategies, to deal with particular imprints in our life, experiences in our life. And often when they're adverse, when there's some kind of trauma involved, and that doesn't necessarily mean, what people would really perceive as big trauma. It can be anything that's got strong emotions attached to it, really. It's when we experience that in those younger years that we develop coping strategies. We develop strategies of kind of often fragmentation. So there are parts of ourselves, parts of our experience that we kind of want to disassociate from, that we want to fragment from. And a lot of the inner child transformation is very much about reintegrating, about realigning, reclaiming the parts of ourselves. Sometimes people have come across it described as the shadow parts of ourselves, which is not, the negative parts. It's just those aspects of ourselves that we personally have experienced maybe as unacceptable, unlovable, not what people want us to be. So they get rejected. And you were talking before we came on about, helping people to find peace, and actually finding the first thing you had to deal with was a lot of anger. And of course, if anger, for example, was not acceptable in your experience as a young one, what are you going to do with that? You're going to develop a strategy, aren't you? And that strategy might be to do with suppressing it, locking it away somewhere viscerally in your energetic field, in your body. But basically it becomes unconscious. So in a nutshell, we're looking at these unconscious patterns that come to the fore, particularly in situations of crisis and adversity and when things are difficult. Does that make sense?
It does make perfect sense. And it's interesting, as you're talking, I'm thinking a lot of people, even coaches, you know, sometimes, because we are still human, of course, will not be aware of these patterns, will not be aware of that, and will just think, well, that's just how I am, or that's my personality, or that's what I've always done. And even that's best case scenario, because I suppose a lot of people are completely unaware that there may even be any kind of coping mechanism or strategy in place, unless it's a very severe one and it's like, gosh, this is a big problem, like an eating disorder or an addiction or alcohol or something that is obviously a problem. But there can be lots of other problems. And I suppose a great question I always think is like, what's the problem with the problem? Because we have a lot of problems, don't we? So if we kind of take coaches and people that are helping other people to transform and change, why is inner child work so important for us as a coaching collective?
Well, my passion definitely is equipping coaches with their own personal resilience and development. So in all the time that I've trained coaches, my priority is always the coach first and the client second. And part of that, as you're asking about, is because my belief and experience is that we can't take our clients beyond where we've been ourselves or where we're aware of and prepared to go. So when we as coaches really dive into those deeper levels of ourselves and start to understand our own unconscious patterning, we're much more likely to be able to recognize it in a client and to raise a client's awareness of it. We touched on, didn't we, in our previous conversation, and this is of course very close to your heart in terms of the accreditation of the industry, that there are many, many offerings of coach training where there really is no attention to the development of the practitioner. It's all kind of tools-based and skills-based. And what happens then when we get into the relational aspect of coaching, and then there's a dynamic playing out between us as a coach and a client, you know, the fragmented parts, the unconscious patterns, the inner children all come out to play. Now,
chaos.
If you don't know that's what's happening, and it's not acknowledged, it's not worked with, then of course that's when we start to get projection, that's when we start to get transference, that's when we start to get it gets messy, basically. We don't raise awareness.
And it's easy to see how that can happen, and I really like the way that you say it's like, you know, it's a coach first approach, which is really, really important, because often coaches coach other coaches, and so this work is of paramount, that development, like you said, the development of the coach, the development of the practitioner. And I would imagine that, I mean, I can only talk on my own experience as well, that prior to any of that work being done, everything's very much kind of strategy based, conscious mind based, you know, like thinking head based, and that doesn't always work. There's going to come a point where that's going to really hit a block quite quickly with clients. And I think my experience, this work was really raised to me when I trained as a coach. And so therefore you talk about the qualities in training and why they need to be really well resourced, well supported going forward, and continue to do this work, because it's not about just having a bunch of skills and tools, is it? It's like, wow, look at my toolkit, look at all my certificates, look at all the things I've learned with my brain. And so that was definitely my experience, that as a new coach, and certainly during that coach training over all those months, it started to really percolate and the awareness started to rise. And I remember at the beginning, I thought, this is going to be amazing. I am going to be a coach. I'll be able to help people. It's all I've ever wanted to do. I've got a holistic background as well of helping, and that's what I wanted to do. And I thought, brilliant. I really wasn't expecting the path ahead, to be honest. And I think that's, you know, it's important to share, because I had a lot of skills from my past career. I was, you know, on the ball, I was doing the training, And I did think at that point I would be able to add all of this, and that's what I will do, and that will be my job. So
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting, especially of course coupled with NLP, which is super powerful, I wasn't expecting it. So sometimes, like you say, you can only take people as far as you've gone, and that can be quite a difficult space for a new coach, really, can't it? And also maybe even an advanced coach. What about the people that have done a lot of training and, you know, accredited work? I mean, you can't really avoid it during that work, but it's not specifically in coach training like that, is it? So let's talk
No.
about that for a minute, like how that's
Yeah.
different, really.
Well, what I was thinking about as you were saying that is often it's the emotional life that people often kind of hit up against when they're very skilled. So let's say you've got skilled in your curiosity and your questioning and you're starting to open things up with a client. Well, invariably, emotion is going to come into play. So our clients are going to access certain emotions, often that are unexpected, that have been held maybe historically, layered over and over and over and over. And when a coach, hasn't been through that experience of really being able to sit with and hold a client in that space, it can be quite frightening. It can be quite like, and this is where it can touch back on the coach's own inner child imprinting in terms of, well, how was it modeled to them to handle and hold emotions? Like, you know, are they comfortable with people experiencing or expressing distress or anger, as you said, or frustration or hurt? And if they're not, if they've got their own strategies for that, right, we're going to shut that down, not consciously, of course. You know, there's many ways in which we can shut each other down unconsciously because we don't feel safe, and therefore we're not going to be able to hold a safe space. So we start to get into, I guess, really the arena of coaching being potentially very therapeutic. Now, of course, we've got the differences between coaching and therapy, but we've also got so many beautifully creative aspects of coaching coming to the fore now. I mean, you mentioned there, obviously, well, you talked about in my own experience, body wisdom and equine, and people will be doing all kinds of things out there. And, you know, as we get more creative, as we're using the whole self, you said you're a holistic practitioner, you're bringing that in, we're paying attention, aren't we, to the emotional body, to the energetic body, as well as the mental body, as well as the physical body. And that's where, for me, it becomes, as I train coaches and as I work with clients, invariably, people will go to the imprinting of some childhood experience or memory. And it's not contained purely within that. I was doing supervision this morning, and one of the coaches there was talking about her inner child. She's now, you know, she's very au fait with looking after her inner child when that aspect of her comes up. But what I offered to her was, look, you've actually done a lot of work on that. You've done a lot of cleaning up on that. But what you're still doing as an adult is you're still running the, say, persecutor pattern with yourself as an adult. So it's like you've got the awareness that the inner child needs resourcing or looking after or needs you alongside her. But actually, you're still treating your adult self in the same way. And actually, sometimes,
so interesting.
Not just that we need to resource and heal the younger self or those aspects of ourselves, reclaim that, but we need to recognize, well, in the present moment, I'm still running the same pattern. I'm still maybe persecuting myself, not forgiving myself, considering myself to be not good enough, all of those things. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Or if
so there's different, I can't remember what my question was now. I've got so involved in that. But there's different facets is what I'm hearing. Is this, you know, different elements to it. And also what I'm hearing is the explanation that the inner child is like your emotional self, is your emotional body. And it's also the younger, the past. So can you talk a little bit about how that inner child is created from those patterns? You've touched on it a little bit with regards to how you may handle emotions. For instance, if there was a lot of anger in your childhood, and a lot of shouting and a lot of distress and a lot of expression of emotion, if you're going to then, and that's not been resolved, you're going to encounter a client that's quite angry or expressive, that's going to be difficult for you to deal with. And like you said, there might be like shutdowns or responses, or aka triggers in ourselves. And of course, then it all starts going into the mixing pot and losing the thread and the intention of coaching, which can be confusing for both parties. So I suppose it's really about understanding, maybe a little bit of understanding about how that is developed and the key things to look out for. Some of the hotter spots, if you like.
Yes. So I'm thinking about how when we encounter things, you talked about triggers there. So when we encounter relationships, people's behaviors, things that we respond to or react to, we often, without the awareness of where that reaction is coming from, we may then project onto that other person, or we may be responding to a situation that's not really about the situation. It's about the history. It's about the original imprint, the original wound, the original trauma. So, for example, if you're talking about someone's anger there, rather than being able to respond to that as your fully resourced adult self, who isn't actually in any real danger, who can sit alongside that and have someone express themselves, if your programming kicks in, that very visceral, emotional programming that's locked into your history and your body, if that kicks in and goes, oh, now this is my coping strategy here is I shut down, or I withdraw, or this is going to result in something much greater. It's only with that understanding that you can come cleanly to the present moment. So we don't really live in the present moment, do we? Most of us, we are living in either the past or the future most of the time. But equally, what the inner child transformation recognizes is that there is no past, present, or future. It's all stacked, it's all that quantum, it's all happening in the now. Actually, regardless of whether that emotion, that energy emotion, is being generated by a, in quotes, memory, or what's happening in the moment, it kind of doesn't matter. The point is that you are responding in that moment. And if you can get a really good awareness of that being the case, you can actually come into the present of, okay, well, this is what I'm faced with. This is what's happening now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's explaining it very well, but rather than your fragmented self, your younger self going, oh my gosh, this now means this. Keep in your adult self that goes, okay, I can now feel that response coming up, but actually I am no longer that young child. I am now my fully resourced adult self, and I can respond in a different way.
Yeah. And it's that choice, isn't it? And that empowerment that sits in there that I'm hearing. And also the creating of the space.
Yeah.
Creating that space between how we've always responded, like this, and believing that's just it, to the possibility and potential that there is another way, and to be taking those moments, really, and those pauses when you get that horrible feeling in your body, or your stomach lurches, or something tightens up, or you just get whatever trigger that you sense physically or mentally or emotionally. It's just noticing that, isn't it? Really, is the first thing. Noticing how I'm feeling. So that awareness thing, I think obviously that is the key to everything, isn't it? Raising the awareness. So it's almost like it has to be a study of self for quite a while, because no one can tell you this, but you have to start being open towards that kind of self-study and that self-awareness, and just noticing, let's have a look at how I behave first of all, get all that out.
What you're making me in mind to articulate is the difference, obviously, between the reaction and the response is the responsibility.
Yes.
So I love, and it's in my book about the way I teach, is Cartman's triangle, drama triangle. Because really understanding how, when we're in the victim, often it's our child self is in victim, because of course often the child can be quite powerless, they can be overpowered. But recognizing when we're in that place of that victim or that persecutor or rescuer, coming out and taking personal responsibility, causes a massive shift in our relationships and our the way we create reality, because actually suddenly, rather than being in
Yes.
a reactive, oh, this is happening to me scenario, we can step out and go, no, I am creating this. This is my response that's important here, not what's actually happening. And that's a huge game changer for people.
Oh, it's massive. It takes quite a while to kind of absorb into the system as well. It's like, I'm hearing the NLP communication model there, basically, of how we create reality and how we create our maps of the world. And I don't know about you, Sarah, but I always used to believe myself. I always used to think, yeah, this is this and that is that and that's right and you're wrong and I had it all going on, and of course that does still happen. And I think when we hear words like victim, they can be quite triggering as well when you're learning this kind of work. And so I think it's important that you highlighted there any kind of powerless state, as a child literally can be a victim. People can be victims, or you can have a victim mindset, or you can behave like a victim when actually you're not. And so all of that is coming from that pot of that past program and that imprinting. So it's quite a lot to unpack, isn't it? And nobody wants to think of themselves as a victim. It's got that the meaning that society has put on that isn't a positive one, and immediately implies that you're disempowered. I can often catch myself in sort of victim thinking. It could just be complaining. Oh well, poor me. It's not like that. It's all right for them. And you go into these little thinking patterns, and it's just really so easy now to catch them like in a little net. We're always cleaning ourselves up. And so I think it's not about being perfect, but about being able to sort of lean into our human experience, and create that awareness.
Totally. I love the fact that you said, I used to believe myself. Because it is, your psyche is that inner voice. That psyche is constant, and it's constantly fighting for its own survival. So of course it holds on to the identification of self. It holds on to the small self. It wants to make it all about that. And when you, as you said, when you fully appreciate that and kind of sit behind that, so get into your pure consciousness, and this for me is very much part of the spiritual journey.
Yes.
When you can really recognize that actually you are not that voice, you are not that psyche, you are pure consciousness, as you said, having a human experience. So rather than getting completely seduced into being the human experience, you can draw back and witness that. So you can have that kind of nice humor filled kind of like, oh God, what nonsense am I talking now?
Yes. And also, I suppose, allow, when this kind of work's been done, you can allow somebody else to offer you such deep reflections and gifts that before doing any kind of this work, just absolutely would just reject, because the ego's like, sorry, I don't think so. I'm not having that.
Does not fit. Yes.
No. And so I suppose it's really, let's talk about like the symptoms in our lives. What would be the symptoms of your inner child calling for some healing, either professionally or personally? And we've talked about triggers a little bit, and sometimes people don't know what their triggers are, because they're so stuck in their story, they may not even understand that language. But presuming that as coaches listening to this podcast that people do, what kind of symptoms would we be looking out for as coaches or in our lives that might indicate us towards this work?
I think we've covered it perfectly when we've talked about the victim, when we've talked about well, in fact, all three of those roles, the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. Because what we're not doing when we're in that triangle is we're not taking responsibility. So if you think about the child having, as we said, often being powerless, actually often being overpowered by the very nature of being a child and relying on those people around us in our caregivers in our world. When we find ourselves, as you said, blaming, criticizing, moaning, wishing it was different, arguing with reality, If
I
everybody
like
else
that one, arguing with reality.
That's when we know
Mm.
that actually we need to pay attention to the fact that we've relinquished responsibility for our own lives. We've relinquished responsibility for our own experience. And we will often find the child there because that was the child's reality often. And especially when you're working with people who've had, trauma, they've been physically overpowered, they've been abused, they've really been through experiences that have taken away their autonomy, given them the experience that they don't have a voice, they don't have that power, they don't have that autonomy. So when we recognize that we have the fear kicking in that goes, well, you can't say that, or you can't do that, or, well, that person's in control, I'm not in control, it's happening to me. I think if you ever feel like life is happening to you, then you probably need to come back into self and start to pay attention to, right, what's that part of me that needs to be resourced, that needs to be healed, that needs to take back their power, actually.
That's a really good way of explaining it. And what about the persecutor and the rescuer? So if we take off the language and we just give that a couple of examples, what would you give us there, Sarah?
Well, of course, none of those roles can exist without the others. So if you're taking the victim role, you're going to invite naturally anybody else to take either the persecutor or the rescuer role. And if you're the rescuer, you're going to invite someone to take the others, and so on. And we see that massively in family, in all dynamics. We can ping around the roles in one conversation. So we can move around those. And generally speaking, people probably have ones that they're more comfortable with. Some people are going to be more comfortable with the persecutor, some with the rescuer, some with the victim. But actually, if you really study Cartman's work and you go underneath, they are all victim roles because none of them are taking personal responsibility.
That's the common factor, isn't it? There's no personal responsibility, and you've mentioned that word before. And it's interesting, bouncing around that can give one quite the headache some weeks, or depending on the situations. The rescuer one, that's a little bit interesting, isn't it, sometimes in the coaching world, because there can be some tendencies to especially in the early days, to want to save people, even with not having that language on it. It's just more of an energy to want, and then that leads to sort of overgiving, of course, which then leads back to quite disempowerment, because you could then think, well, I'm not getting back what I give, and I give so much, etc., etc. And sometimes you see this play out, when people are sharing their experiences online, coaches or otherwise, and you can see these bounce arounds. But of course, when you're in it, you can't see it. And so that's the power, really, isn't it, of having the reflections and the mirrors of other coaches, mentors, etc. But the best way, I still believe the best way, is you can learn all of that and have all of that. You've got to be able to do it yourself, because at the end of the day, when you're in a situation, and we've all been there, where suddenly something is happening and you're in the situation, got to be able to have those tools to manage that, and have that self-management, that self-leadership, and that awareness, because you're not going to have your coach or your mentor or your best reflector with you in the moment. So that's really, for me, that's been a lot of the actual integration of the tools and the learning of it.
I think that's the difference, Teresa, between what you said there about having tools and embodying, integrating. That's the difference, because if you're equipped with tools, then it's so easy to drop out of awareness, and therefore you don't even know how to use those. If you've journeyed to embody the change, if it's sustainable because you've gone to the root cause, and you've it's almost like gradually dissolving the psyche. It's kind of challenging the psyche, and freeing yourself, really, ultimately, of all of those programs and rules and beliefs, exactly like you said, all of the stuff that you've believed, that you've chosen as true, as real, as opposed to, actually, this is all a narrative.
Well, I had no idea. I mean, I don't think anybody would too much, really, pre-coaching or pre this world or pre-self-development, that question had never really been raised. And, I was sensible and intelligent and I knew what was what. And of course I knew, when I might be going a bit over the top or, slight overreaction, things like that. But then that was the end of that. There was nothing really more that would really come from that. And so I think, that embodiment is so important because, it's easy to find ourselves with a lot of tools and a massive toolkit and very little embodiment, and then all the tools and all the lists, and then getting really triggered over something. And it's like, what's that about? What is that about? So I think that integration, and that's the work that you do, isn't it? Sort of bringing that in is really lovely. And I would like to, if that's okay, just talk for a minute about the session that we had, which we often refer to. And you will have done a million sessions since, but for me, that was like the session that started everything. And that was back when I was a new coach, and I was always been drawn to healing work and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought this would be great. And I had a wonderful conversation with you on the phone, and I thought, yeah, Sarah's great. I definitely want to go along, have a session on all of this. And my inner deepest psyche knew exactly what it was all about. And as soon as I kind of got off the call, or a little bit of time went by, I thought, oh, well, that was good to sort of talk to Sarah about a few things. I don't think I need to go now. And I don't know if you remember us having another conversation where I said that was how I was feeling, and I had noticed that. And you said it was totally understandable because my subconscious is saying, we don't need to do that. Thank you very much. No, we won't do that. So all the strategies are kicked in of like, don't do this. We're going to just shut that down. And if I wasn't aware of that, I would actually say that was quite a battle. And that can be just like a sensation, feeling like you want to do something and I really want to do it, but there's something that really doesn't want to do it. And so those are the parts within. And it could be anything in life, really. I think people come up against that a lot. And so for me, I would sense the inner child in that way. But also all the protection and the mechanism systems also working against it, and that they are super strong. But of course I did turn up, but I don't know if I ever told you, and now I'm telling, I don't know how many thousands of people as well, that when I got near to where you were, I pulled up because I was early. I wanted to be early. I pulled up and I had a whole battle with myself about not coming to the session. And I thought, I don't need to go. And it was really, really visceral. It was really, really strong. And I thought, this is ridiculous because I'm just going, to a session. But of course, there was so much going on within me. And then when we had the session, I now realize that pretty much my 11-year-old self was in that session and not enjoying a moment of it, as she felt exposed and prized on, and it was like so guarded. It was so difficult. And I remember thinking, what is this? I thought, what is this? I paid good money for this. What's going on? And I always remember you being, incredibly empathetic. And you did say something that I won't share on the public podcast, but you did say something which was absolutely groundbreaking for me. And it was a question around separation and sort of like enmeshment. And I remember thinking, what again? But you take it all. And after that session, I drove all the way home, was crying my eyes out. I didn't know why. And I thought, well, I won't be doing that again. Thank you very much. I remember thinking, I don't think I'll be revisiting that, thanks. But at the same time, I had a lot to unpack and a lot to figure out. And we might just think that one event or one session or something is in that time, in that space, in that hour or so we spent together, but it's still unpacking now over the last few years because of everything that it was connected to. And so what I'm trying to get to is that sometimes it can be rather a strong thing to start working with, depending on what your knowledge is of what it may be attached to. We all kind of know, don't we? We know what our stuff is, and we know what's been touched, what's been looked at, what hasn't. But sometimes we don't. But I found it to be quite confronting. I think that's the word.
Yeah.
And so a lot of resistance would come up in my subconscious that said, this is not safe to do this. That's not safe to do this. And so at the same time, I'm taking that, and then I'm still learning coaching skills and tools, and I'm reading everything and sort of really into it. But the embodiment of that has been over the next 4 years. So one thing that I'd like to share is that this is not fast work. It's not like, oh, let's just do a course, let's do a program, and then I'm done. Because depending on what you're dealing with, there can be some real breakthroughs, but the embodiment part of it, that's where the work is. You could learn something, I'm sure, in reasonably short amount of time, but it won't make sense until you actually start to embody it. And so at this point, everything is transformed in my life. Literally, I have transformed so much, done so much work around that area. But the first session there was really, really pivotal, but also very, very difficult. So again, depending on where anybody might be, I think with this kind of work, I would share that the most important thing is the person that you do it with. Because there's a lot of people with a lot of things online. There's a lot of people with a lot of offers that, you Google inner child and you'd get overwhelmed, just as you would with coaching or trauma or anything like that. So can you talk a little bit about that, Sarah? Because I think that that's really important, about the holding space and why training is important. But even with not with training, just the empathy keys, the safety keys, the choice and the empowerment that's always with somebody. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because
absolutely,
that's important.
Yes, and I've never trained anyone in the inner child process that I haven't trained in coaching.
Okay.
And it's what you're saying, to equip someone with, and it wouldn't be dissimilar in the world of NLP, for example, for someone to learn some of the NLP tools, timeline therapy in particular, and then just go out and do it on someone. Because as you say, there's so much happening in that space between us as client and coach. And, this is very therapeutic work as well. So there'll be many people out there who are counselors and therapists who use this nature of this work. And I've trained many of those. Because as you say, it's that relational aspect. Now, we're already sharing an energy field. And as you pointed out, your unconscious already knew when you were on your way. So it already knew what, and actually, although you referred to your unconscious going, it's probably more your conscious, i.e. that part of you that wants to defend the psyche, the small self, as opposed to the unconscious, which is actually what brought you here. It's actually
other way around, more like.
And when you were talking, I was thinking about it's when we use the head, heart, and gut brains. So a lot of you mentioned earlier, you were asking me about the inner child and connected to emotion. And yes, again, those people are familiar with TA. They'll know very much that the child aspect of ourselves is that emotional self. So it often sits in the heart and the intuition in the gut. So when you get that argument with the intellect, with the head self, which is often over relied on, I would say, in our culture, in the way that we educate, in the way that we prioritize the intellect,
yes, definitely,
over intuition and so on, and the heart and feelings. It's like integrating those and aligning those brains as well. So all of the work is that holistic integration. So to come back to what you were saying about the ability of the practitioner to have already done that work, to be aligned as much as possible in themselves, so for example, in your session, had I not done that work, had I just been applying a tool, a process, I wouldn't have been able to acknowledge what was happening relationally between us in terms of your fear and your desire to run. I mean, the number of clients that I've had in their bodies, I'm just thinking about a gentleman in this very room, actually, and he couldn't sit in the seat and he had to get up, and then he was like, I really, really, really want to run. And we could work with that because, of course, it was his young self that was like, got to get out there, got to get out of here, because that was the strategy. That was the strategy of the younger self. Now, for him as an adult man, nothing terrible was going to happen to him in our session, but it wasn't his adult self that was responding.
Absolutely.
It was and as you said, to be able to handle that with with great honor and gravitas and brevity is really important. And therefore, yes, I don't train coaches in this process unless they're experienced, they've trained with me already, or they're experienced enough in holding space, knowing their own emotional life, being able to not project, all of those things that we go through and do proper training, I would say.
So it's really not recommended to get some, inner child online course with a journal as thick as your Bible, and just try and work your way through it, which is often what's on offer out there.
You can absolutely do some great internal work on by yourself. You absolutely can, but
absolutely,
if you're being set something online, we will use Tad James' timeline in terms of mapping out life and the significant events and so on. Well, if you're going to do that by yourself, you might just find, oh gosh, actually some stuff's kind of, a bit like you wanted to shut it down. Whereas when you're with someone who's right there alongside you and kind of sitting in the fire with you, as I would say, they're not going to let you do that, because their contract with you is, I'm here and we're going to do this, as opposed to the shutting down or the running away.
Yeah. And I suppose, depending what's being brought and what your inner child needs to heal, that's never happened before. No one's ever sat with you in the fire, and it's always that's all those mechanisms come in. So it can be incredibly uncomfortable. And I remember the feeling of like, okay, well, I'll just get through this. Like, how long have we got to go? And I really found even, and I'm just sharing this because I think it's important to share the learnings and go back to realize how that sort of protection shows up and how difficult it can be to do some of this work. Because I remember just finding even like eye contact really difficult. Like you were really like invading me, and I had to protect myself. And just thinking, when is this session over? It's like felt like the longest session in the world. Even though there was like part of me was enjoying it. It was so interesting, so powerful, so interesting. But that's the thing, someone, I think that's probably the key as well, isn't it, to holding space, is being able to sit next to someone while they're in their fire, and really be okay with that, because there's nothing that feels safer than someone that's not trying to fix you, isn't affected by your emotion, but can show you enough empathy, and you can work through it yourself. It's like the power that we have, Sarah, actually, it's really about unlocking. I think it's important to I mean, that's been described with some of my clients that said, I just feel like you've unlocked me. And I will say to them, you've unlocked you. You've unlocked you. But it's like we have keys, and we have ways, and we have picks to help do that, really. So I think it's beautiful work, and have that experience of it and since. And I also think that it is very important for coaches, because it just helps us to be able to go deeper, but be able to spot what's going on, take note of that, and have awareness. And depending on the remit of the coach, and maybe not doing anything about it, but noticing that and seeing where that shows up, and at a different point raising that and making a recommendation.
I've got a real catch in my throat, so I obviously need to say this. Excuse me.
Okay. We're real humans on a podcast.
But you you made me think, as you were talking then, about parenting.
Yes.
And you were talking about the need, excuse me, obviously really important I say this. So as you were speaking then about the coach's ability to hold that space, to hold that safety, like you said, it's, probably will never have happened before that somebody's just been able to sit alongside and empower, like not fix, not overpower, but just empower. It's one of the things that when coaches train, it affects all their other relationships in their life, and parenting in particular. Because our ability to be a container for our children's feelings, our ability to be able to sit alongside our children not to make them better, stop them crying, fix it, stop them hurting, but actually just to really be there while they have all their feelings and they have that release and they have that expression, and they access, as you said, their own resources and understand that they're a powerful resource being. That's not easy to do. That's not easy. And to do the inner child work on yourself, I think massively gives you that ability. And that so many students have said that, how it's impacted their parenting and their other relationships.
Oh, it's absolutely a game changer. I mean, certainly I would say it's totally transformed. I mean, you know, I was pretty aware of stuff like that before with my daughter. She's 15 now, but for the last sort of 5 or 6 years, it has literally transformed how I hold the space for her as a parent. It's enabled our relationship to be deeper. It's enabled me to create really great boundaries and make sure there isn't sort of like enmeshment there, especially being a single mum. As the child gets older, or even when they're younger, developing that kind of like best friend thing, or you know, that sort of thing. So I'm super aware of that. And also of being able to validate her feelings without absorbing them to mine. So it's like, you're so upset, so I must be upset. So I'm not fostering codependency there on either side. And I'm super passionate about parenting as well, and also how NLP and all of this work can shape up better parents, because our younger generations are struggling. And if they go forward in the way that they are, then I dread to think what's coming, you know, what that evolution is really all about, and what's going to happen. And the thing is, if we modeled on our parents, of course they're going to be modeling on us. And the minute that penny drops where you think, oh, I'm teaching them to be like me, it's really quite a piece to just realize how that psychology all just repeats, and then also to change that. And so, yeah, it's definitely a big part of my life in terms of how I relate to Mia and how our relationship is. She's even said she's willing to come on the podcast and talk about these kinds of things, but we haven't done it yet, but I think we will, because it's just in action sort of demonstration of how it can really work and how it can heal. And energetically how it can heal and help them as well, because children get shut down a lot, don't they? I mean, you were talking earlier about shush, you know, don't make a noise, don't be upset. First thing we do when our little ones are upset is rush to soothe and rush to take care. And I'm not saying we should leave them screaming and bloody knees in the street, of course, but there's nothing wrong with their expression. I mean, they're very expressive, aren't they? They'll tell you when they're screaming from a really young age with their communication. And it's just the way the world works. We're modeled to kind of quieten them down and bring them into a good routine, doing air quotes, and all of these things in the belief that we're creating great humans. But actually what they need alongside the constructs of that, really, and the guides of life, is the emotional intelligence and the emotional awareness, so that they can navigate what is quite a tricky world, which kind of brings us back to the beginning when we were talking about crisis and the effects of that. So as a parent, as a coach, it's so important to just do this work as a human, really, isn't it, for yourself?
And if we can, as you talked about patterns and generational patterns, you know, and the generational patterns tend to go 7 years, 7 generations past and future, you know, if we can interrupt that by not our children not fragmenting. So as we approach things differently with them and don't make any of their emotions unacceptable, which of course, as you say, is really easy unconsciously to do, because we don't want them to be, say, stressing. My daughter's stressing at the moment about exams. They don't want them to be stressing. We don't want them to be hurting, and we can inadvertently be invited into their drama and start maybe persecuting as much as rescuing. You know, I know that my persecutor can get triggered if my daughter goes into what I perceive to be victim, disempowered. Oh, this is terrible, this is happening, because I don't want it to be disempowered. So then my persecutor goes, no. So
sometimes
rely on it.
My daughter tells me to stop it, you know, so obviously then I'll be involved with saying that. She'll just stop it. She'll stop it. And I'm like, do you know what? Thank you for telling me to stop it. Because in doing that, sometimes I'm also, you know, trying to fix it, and trying to rescue her. So I'm like, oh, I'm being the rescuer. So it's really about always handing back that control, that choice, that empowerment. But it's difficult with children, isn't it? Because to a certain age that they need the guidance and they need those boundaries. And then, so I suppose it's really those kind of like pubescent to teenage years where it really comes to the fore. But certainly being input in the right way for the younger years.
Yeah, and we could
key.
get really expansive about that, because actually even that's a belief that they need guidance, which often our guidance comes from ignorance or fear. It's not always that wise.
Yes, indeed, we're assuming it's so wise.
So we could have a whole other conversation on the wisdom of
yes.
intuition that a child naturally comes into the world with, and really encouraging them to trust themselves, their feelings, their intuition. Yeah, it's a whole other.
Absolutely. What a great catch. That's really, really interesting, because again, you know, they know themselves, we know ourselves better than anybody, but we presume that our children don't. I remember when Mia was born and I brought her home, and I took her around the house and kind of introduced her to every room and said what goes on in this room, and this is your room. And my mum said to me, Teresa, what are you doing? What are you doing? Are you okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. I said, I'm just introducing Mia to the home. I'm telling her where everything is, how it's going to be. And she said, okay. She said, but why? You know, I think she thought I'd already gone a bit postnatal. And I said, because she's tiny and just because she's nonverbal, it doesn't mean that she doesn't understand. And it doesn't mean that she doesn't know what's going on. So I'm not going to assume that. And I'm going to behave as if she does. And I'm introducing her to a new environment, not just like plonking her in like she's the baby. And she looked at me with that real look that sort of says, oh, okay, love, do you know what I mean? Let's make you a cup of tea. And as years have gone by, now she often refers to that and says, at the time, I thought you were a bit nuts, you know, being a little bit extra. I read too many baby books, you know, that kind of thing. And she said, but now I really get it. And even by me doing my work and the development that I have done and continue to want to do, my mum has changed. So this stuff has an impact on, you know, our families, not just our children that we're talking about here, but our partners, our families, our sisters, our brothers. And we don't have to say to them, hey, listen, sit down, I've got some great stuff to teach you. We just have to embody it and show it. And I have noticed over the last 5 years the change in my mum. And even we talk about it, and you know, she's even got some of the coach speak going on and talking about all kinds of things, you know, that she wouldn't have talked about before. And she says, no, she says, you know, I listen and I've taken it on board. And, you know, she's really made some sort of changes, very subtle, but her understanding has evolved. She used to say, oh, I'm too old to change and I'm too old to, it's too late now, you know, I am how I am. And it was very fixed. Yeah. So the impact is what really I'm alluding to, is the impact of the work that we do. It's a higher mission. It's not about us always just being great coaches and being able to get clients and build our businesses and all the stuff that we talk about. But it's really the impact beyond, because, you know, it's like, you know, the mission, it's the mission point, isn't it? It's the mission and the beyond. Who else does this impact, and how? Why would we go through all this? Because it's not easy. I mean, if I dug all my books and journals, and if you dug all your books and journals, and anyone that's listening, how much have you journaled? Like, we could have a library full. It's quite the effort, you know, the tears and the pain and the processing. Why do we do it? It's all for a higher mission. And that's why I do it anyway, for my own healing, but also for my daughter's healing, for my mum, for anyone that comes into my world that I can affect and learn from, and also teach and just shift in little ways, because it's a ripple effect, isn't it? I mean, that is my passion. That is my mission, is the ripple effect. And so, you know, yours sounds very similar. I mean, let's wrap up with, tell us what your mission is, Sarah, really, with all of this.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking there, and I was thinking, yeah, well, basically, we teach what we most need to learn, right? So every time I put on a new program or a new training or something, it's because I need to learn it. So
yes, yeah.
All my inner child work really is about coming back home to myself, you know, the abandonment of my teenage self, I would say. And probably all of the work that I do ultimately, as you say, is a spiritual healing journey. So as wonderful as it is to help others along their journey, you know, all my students and clients are helping me just as much on mine.
Yes. And I've really learned the juice of that as well, that learning piece, because I think, you know, the early days, you think, well, you know, I'm a coach and this is what I'm going to be able to do for you. This is what I'm going to be able to offer for you. And it's all that outward as well. That's some of the rescuer even showing up there. And then as you evolve and develop, you're like, wow, my clients are actually my greatest teachers. And I also see myself in them. So they are almost the mirrors for the parts sometimes that need extra healing in me. And so the discernment to be able to look at that and reflect on those sessions. The amount of times I've gone into sessions, Sarah, and the client may start talking, and and in my mind I think, hold on a minute, is this my session? Your session? It's like they know exactly and start exactly, and it's just that blows my mind every single time. Note to self. And so it really is really powerful. And I've read your book, which is great. I mean, I would recommend that for anybody that wants to dive a little bit deeper into this, but also your methods of coaching, transformational coaching. Do you have it to hand? I'm thinking, oh, I should have this to hand, but I'm going to rely on you having it to hand as it's your book, because anyone that's actually watching this can just see. So this is the copy of Sarah's book for all of you that are watching this on YouTube. And Find Your True North. And I really enjoyed this book. I still go back to it many times. And so anybody that wants to get I've got to share this, Sarah, so you can see, and for everyone listening. Guess what's here as a bookmark? This is a picture of, you can't really see it because it was 19 goodness knows when, let's not say, but it's a picture of me. It's an inner child picture. It's a picture of me as a little girl in a concert. So I think that's at my lower school. So I must have been around 7 or 8 at that point and used it. So it's just really, like, isn't that sweet? So there's the book. And also you have a program coming up. Tell us a little bit about that.
So starting in the summer, so we're running a retreat out in Greece in July. This is a venue that we've been using for the last few years. It's an amazing venue, and it actually goes back to what we were saying about when you experienced your session and went away from your session. So we'll be running the inner child training, but also people can come on the retreat to do their own inner child work. And because immersion, because you're completely immersed in the work for the sort of 4 or 5 days, you can really work through some stuff that otherwise you might want to withdraw or retract from. So it has that really nice element of holding you in that retreat space and really giving you all of the time and space you need to work on your stuff. And then if you're doing the training, it carries on for another 6 months of calls then to right.
Yeah. So am I hearing that there's 2 options?
Yes, exactly.
With the retreat. Yeah. So do you want to just tell us briefly what they are?
Yes, so you can either, if you're already a trained coach, or you've got the kind of skills from being, because sometimes it does come through therapeutic work like counsellors and other practitioners. But if you've got those skills, that you've got that foundation, then you can come and do the Inner Child Transformation course. So you can learn to use the process with your clients. And if you know, actually, you've listened to this today and you think, yeah, I've got some stuff I could really do with working on for myself, with my own inner child stuff, then you can come as a retreat participant and enjoy the workshops and the one-to-one input and work on your own stuff. So you've got those.
Fantastic. And that's in July. So what date is that in July?
That's the 1st to the 6th of July.
1st to the 6th of July. Beautiful. So what I'll do is I'll put the link for that if anyone's interested in finding out a little bit more. Put the link for that into the show notes, and then of course you can always arrange to have a conversation with Sarah about this or anything else that has risen for your attention during this podcast, any of the conversations, or indeed myself. So yeah, I would love to talk to you all day, but I'm going to wrap it up, force myself to stop. And for all of you that have joined us right to the end, thank you so much. And I hope that you've really gained something of an insight somewhere during that whole conversation, which will will just direct you where you need to go. So we trust that that will happen. So thank you so much, Sarah, for your time and your insight and your wisdom, and for sharing all of that. Really, really appreciated the conversation. And for any of you that would like to join over on Facebook, you can come and join Coach Community and be in the free Facebook group, or you might want to come to one of our Coach Connect meetups, which is networking for coaches and consultants, the third Friday of every month. So you can contact me for that. And Sarah, are you around on LinkedIn and the socials? Where do you prefer to be connected? What's your because we are all
I have
everywhere.
a love-hate relationship with social media for sure. Like I'm sure
don't we all?
But yes, can be found on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So yeah,
okay,
have a presence in all those places.
Great. So the good thing is we're easy to find, whether we love it or not. So we love it when people find us there, and we hate it when we don't like it. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for all of you who tuned in. Speak to you soon.